My name is Fiona, and I'm 54 years old. For the past 5 years, I've been living alone in the little house my late husband Daniel and I built together. When he passed away, I thought the silence of that house would break me. But over time, I grew used to it. I learned to fill the quiet with music, work, and the laughter of my daughter Harper, who visited every Sunday. Life wasn't perfect, but it was mine. I ran a small craft store in our neighborhood, a cozy little place filled with handmade quilts, scented candles, and local art. It didn't make me rich, but it kept me busy and content. That evening had been especially long. The rain had started early, pelting against my car windshield as I drove home. I remember humming along to an old jazz song on the radio, thinking about the cup of tea I'd make before bed. But when I turned onto my street, something felt wrong. My porch light was flickering, casting long, broken shadows across the driveway. As I got out of the car, I noticed the front door was slightly ajar. My stomach sank. Maybe I forgot to lock it, I whispered to myself, though I knew I hadn't. The moment I pushed the door open, my heart started pounding. The living room looked like a storm had torn through it. Drawers were pulled open, cushions slashed, and the contents of my jewelry box were scattered across the floor. My hands trembled as I called out, "Hello? Is anyone here?" Silence. I backed up, fumbling for my phone, and dialed 911. My voice shook as I explained that someone had broken into my house. The dispatcher told me to stay outside until the officers arrived. I waited in my car, watching the rain blur the edges of my shattered world. When the police finally came, I followed them inside, my breath catching at every step. The officers moved through the rooms, shining flashlights into corners and closets. Everything of value was gone: my savings, the emergency cash I kept in the safe, even the jewelry Daniel had given me on our wedding day. But what hit me hardest was the absence of his gold watch. It had been sitting in a glass case on the dresser, right where he'd left it before he died. Now, that space was empty. I felt something break inside me. When Harper arrived, she ran straight into my arms. "Oh, Mom," she said, holding me tightly. Her husband, Mason, followed close behind, wrapping a blanket around my shoulders and telling me everything would be okay. "I'll take care of it," he said with a steady voice. "You won't have to worry about a thing." He sounded confident, almost rehearsed, but I was too shaken to notice at the time. The officers asked a few questions: if I had any security cameras, if I'd seen anyone suspicious, if I suspected anyone I knew. I could only shake my head. Nothing about this made sense. Mason volunteered to help me file the insurance claim, saying he had experience handling paperwork. He even offered to fix the broken door the next morning. Harper stayed with me that night, sleeping beside me in my bed like she used to when she was a child. I could feel her trembling every time thunder rolled outside. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying every moment in my head. Who would do something like this? Why me? The next few days passed in a blur of police visits, insurance forms, and pitying looks from neighbors. I kept telling myself it was just bad luck, that the world wasn't as cruel as it suddenly seemed. But deep down, something didn't sit right. Mason came over almost every day, always offering to help. He brought new locks, security cameras, even offered to keep some of my remaining valuables safe at his house until things settled. I thought it was sweet of him, even though I hesitated. He was family after all, or so I believed. But there were little things I couldn't ignore, like how he flinched when the police mentioned fingerprints, or how he seemed overly curious about what the investigators had found or hadn't. He'd ask questions that felt oddly specific, like, did they find any footprints outside the back door? At first, I brushed it off as concern. Mason had always been helpful, especially after Daniel's death. He'd come by to fix leaky pipes, help with taxes, or mow the lawn when my arthritis flared up. I trusted him. Still, something in his tone unsettled me. One afternoon, I went to the kitchen to make tea and found him standing near the drawer where I kept my spare keys. When he saw me, he jumped slightly and laughed it off. "Just looking for a pen," he said. I smiled politely but couldn't shake the unease creeping up my spine. By the end of the week, I was exhausted physically, mentally, and emotionally. I told Harper I needed a few days to myself to process everything. She hesitated, clearly worried, but agreed. Mason assured her he'd check in on me, which only made me feel guilty for doubting him at all. That night, as I sat alone in my dimly lit living room, surrounded by the ruins of what once felt safe, I realized I wasn't just grieving what was stolen. I was grieving my peace of mind, my sense of security. I thought about Daniel, what he'd say if he could see me like this. He'd probably tell me to stand tall, to fight back, to not let anyone make me feel powerless. I wanted to believe I could do that. But as the rain poured outside and the police lights faded from the memory of my driveway, I knew something had changed in me forever. As I stared at the empty space where my husband's watch once lay, I had no idea the real theft hadn't even begun yet. In the weeks that followed, I tried to convince myself everything would return to normal, but nothing did. The robbery had stripped more than just my possessions. It had taken away my sense of safety, the quiet comfort I used to feel in my own home. Every creak of the floorboards made my heart race. Every flicker of the light sent me checking the locks again. Sleep became a stranger, replaced by long nights of silence and unanswered questions. The police called a few times with updates, though they never had anything solid to report. "We're doing everything we can," the officer would say, his tone polite but tired. I could tell my case had joined a long list of unsolved crimes. Meanwhile, my insurance claim was moving slower than molasses. They wanted receipts, serial numbers, appraisals, things I didn't have for half my belongings. It felt like being robbed twice, once by the thieves, and again by the bureaucracy that was supposed to help me. Harper, my daughter, called every day, her voice always soft with worry. "Mom, you shouldn't be there alone," she kept saying. "Just stay with us for a little while." At first, I refused. I didn't want to feel like a burden. Harper and Mason had their own lives to live, their own home to manage. But every time I hung up the phone, the empty house seemed to grow larger, colder, and heavier with ghosts of memories. Then one afternoon, Harper showed up unannounced. She had that determined look in her eyes, the same one she used to get as a little girl when she'd made up her mind about something. "Pack a bag," she said gently. "You're coming with us, just for a week or two." Mason was waiting in the car when I stepped outside with my suitcase. He smiled wide, too wide, and got out to help me. "You're doing the right thing," he said warmly. "You shouldn't be alone right now." The words were kind, but something about his tone rubbed me the wrong way. Still, I brushed it off. Maybe it was just my nerves. Their house was beautiful, modern, open, filled with bright light and sleek furniture. Harper had always had a good eye for design, but I couldn't help noticing how expensive everything looked. New countertops, a massive TV, and even a brand new coffee machine that probably cost more than my car. As I settled into their guest room, Mason came in with a cup of tea. "Harper told me you like chamomile," he said, smiling as he handed it to me. "That's kind of you," I replied, trying to sound grateful. He sat on the edge of the bed, chatting about his plans to find a new job soon. He'd been laid off a few months earlier, and though he talked about projects and potential clients, I wasn't sure what any of it meant. But what caught my attention was the sleek smartwatch on his wrist, a model I'd seen advertised online for nearly $1,000. He caught me looking and chuckled. "Oh, got it used. Great deal." "Ah," I said softly, nodding. But my chest tightened. It wasn't just the watch. There were new sneakers by the door, designer ones, and a set of car keys on the counter with a logo I didn't recognize. I told myself not to overthink it. People buy things. Maybe he had some savings tucked away. Maybe Harper helped him. But the timing, it gnawed at me. That night, I woke up to get some water and heard voices coming from the living room. I froze at the top of the stairs when I recognized them, Harper and Mason. "She's still so shaken," Harper whispered. "I don't know how to help her." Mason's tone was calm. Too calm. "Just give it time. She'll get over it. Besides, what's done is done." "What's done is done," I repeated under my breath, frowning. What did that mean? I leaned closer, careful not to make a sound. "Are you sure we shouldn't just tell her?" Harper asked. Mason's response came quick and sharp. "No, she doesn't need to know everything. It's better this way." My heart began to hammer in my chest. Know everything about what? I stayed frozen there for what felt like an eternity, my hand gripping the railing so hard my knuckles turned white. When the conversation faded into silence, I tiptoed back to my room, mind spinning. Maybe they were talking about something else, something harmless. Maybe I was reading too much into it. The stress of the robbery, the insomnia, the constant fear it could make anyone paranoid, right? But I couldn't shake Mason's words from my head. She doesn't need to know everything. The next morning, Mason acted like nothing had happened. He made pancakes, cracking jokes while Harper laughed, though her smile didn't quite reach her eyes. I sat quietly, forcing bites of food down, pretending I hadn't heard a thing. After breakfast, I decided to take a walk. The air outside was cool, crisp, and smelled faintly of rain. As I strolled down the street, I thought about how much had changed since Daniel died. Back then, Harper was the one who needed protecting. Now it felt like I was the one being sheltered from something, only I didn't know what. When I returned, I saw Mason out front, talking to a neighbor beside a shiny new car parked in the driveway. The sunlight bounced off its polished surface, blinding me for a moment. It was sleek, expensive looking, definitely not the kind of car someone who just lost his job should be driving. He caught my eye and grinned proudly. "Do you like it? I won it in a raffle online." "Really?" I asked, forcing a smile. "That's quite the prize." Harper came outside, her expression a mix of pride and unease. "Can you believe his luck?" she said, looping her arm through his. But the unease in my gut grew heavier. Luck didn't buy luxury cars. That night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, the pieces of my life began to rearrange themselves in ways I didn't yet understand. The robbery, the sudden wealth, the secrecy, it all felt connected. But one night, I overheard a conversation that made me question everything I thought I knew about him. It started with a whisper outside my room, a sound that shouldn't have been there at midnight. I remember waking up suddenly, my heart pounding in the quiet darkness of Harper and Mason's house. For a moment, I thought I'd imagined it. The wind outside rattled the window slightly, and I told myself to relax. But then I heard it again, a low voice, muffled but unmistakably human. I slipped out of bed, pulling my robe tightly around me. The house was still except for that sound coming from down the hallway. I crept to the door and pressed my ear against it. Mason's voice. I couldn't make out every word, but what I did hear sent chills crawling down my spine. "She doesn't suspect a thing," he whispered. My breath caught. "She doesn't suspect a thing? Who was she?" I leaned closer, careful not to make a noise. I recognized Harper's voice next, softer, hesitant, filled with something that almost sounded like guilt. "Are you sure we should have done that?" she whispered. "Done what?" Mason's reply was sharp, a little louder. "It's better this way, Harper. We needed it more than she did." I felt my stomach twist. My mind raced with possibilities, none of them good. Were they talking about me? I took a shaky step back, the wooden floor creaking slightly under my foot. The whispers stopped instantly. I froze, holding my breath, praying they wouldn't come out and see me standing there in the dark. After a long, tense moment, I heard Mason mutter something about going to bed, followed by footsteps moving down the hall. I darted back to my room, my heart hammering so hard I could feel it in my throat. I climbed into bed, pulling the blanket up to my chin as if it could protect me from the thoughts racing through my head. We needed it more than she did. I didn't sleep the rest of that night. Every creak, every sound outside made me jump. The words kept replaying over and over until they no longer felt like a coincidence, they felt like a confession. When the morning came, I forced myself to act normal. At breakfast, Mason was unusually cheerful, whistling as he poured coffee. Harper seemed quiet, distracted, barely meeting my eyes. "Rough night?" Mason asked, handing me a cup. I forced a smile. "Couldn't sleep much. Still adjusting, I suppose." He nodded sympathetically, though I caught a flicker of something in his eyes, something cold, calculating. Well, you're safe here, he said. That's all that matters. The words sounded reassuring on the surface, but there was something off in his tone, too smooth, too confident, as if he were trying to convince himself as much as me. After breakfast, Harper offered to take me shopping for some groceries. Mason stayed home, saying he had calls to make. As we drove, I tried to bring up the conversation from the night before, careful not to sound accusatory. You two seemed to be talking late last night, I began casually. I hope I didn't keep you up with my tossing and turning. Harper's hands tightened on the steering wheel. Oh, that, she said quickly. Mason was just worried about you. We were talking about how hard this has been for you. Her voice trembled just slightly, and she didn't meet my eyes. I appreciate that, I said softly, choosing my words carefully. But you don't have to worry so much. I'll be back on my feet soon. She smiled, but it was small, strained. Of course, Mom. We just want to help. I nodded and let the subject drop. But inside, I felt a growing unease I couldn't shake. Something about her reaction didn't feel right. It wasn't just nervousness, it was fear. Later that afternoon, when we returned home, I found Mason in the garage. He jumped slightly when he saw me, quickly setting down a small black bag he'd been holding. Oh, hey, he said, too cheerfully. Didn't hear you come in. What are you working on? I asked, trying to peek inside the bag. He zipped it up quickly. Just some old tools. Thought I'd organize them. I nodded, though my gut screamed that he was lying. Over the next few days, I started noticing more strange things. Mason always seemed to have private phone calls, speaking in hushed tones whenever Harper wasn't around. He spent long hours out of the house without explaining where he went. And every time I asked Harper about it, she brushed it off, saying, "He's just trying to find work, Mom, don't worry." But I was worried. One evening, Harper went to visit a friend, leaving Mason and me alone in the house. He sat in the living room watching TV, acting perfectly normal. But the moment I excused myself to the kitchen, I saw his reflection in the glass door. He wasn't watching the screen at all. He was watching me. I froze, pretending not to notice, and opened the fridge just to buy myself a moment. My heart pounded as I realized I couldn't keep pretending. Something was very wrong, and I needed to find out what. That night, I stayed awake again, waiting for the whispers to start. Hours passed, the house silent except for the hum of the refrigerator. Just when I thought maybe I'd imagined everything, I heard it footsteps. I crept to my door and cracked it open ever so slightly. Mason was in the hallway, phone to his ear, speaking in a low, urgent tone. "No, she doesn't know," he whispered. "I told you, it's handled. She's not going anywhere." I barely breathed as I watched him pace back and forth. "I'll bring it by on Thursday. The money's coming in. Relax." My stomach twisted. "Money? Bring what by?" He ended the call, slipped the phone into his pocket, and walked back to his room. I stayed frozen until I heard the door close. I felt dizzy, my mind spinning with fear and confusion. What was he hiding? Who was he talking to? The next morning, I stared at him across the breakfast table, trying to see the man my daughter had fallen in love with, but all I could see was a stranger wearing a mask of charm and confidence. And then, as if to confirm every dark suspicion building inside me, he said something that made my blood run cold. He smiled and said, "You know, Fiona, sometimes bad things happen for a reason. It's just the way the world balances itself out." But the next morning, something Mason said confirmed my worst fear wasn't just in my head. When I stepped outside the next day, Mason's shiny new car was parked in the driveway. The sun caught the deep blue paint, gleaming like a jewel. It was one of those luxury sedans you see in commercials, sleek design, leather interior, chrome accents. My first thought was disbelief. I knew Mason hadn't been working for months. There was no way he could afford a car like that. I stood there for a few seconds, just staring, until Mason appeared behind me, holding a cup of coffee and grinning like a man who'd just won the lottery. "Pretty, isn't it?" he said, his tone casual, almost smug. "It's beautiful," I replied slowly. "But when did you—" He cut me off, waving a hand. "Oh, it's the craziest thing. I entered some online raffle last month. Forgot all about it until they called me yesterday to say I'd won. Can you believe it?" He laughed easily, but something in the way his eyes flickered just for a second told me he was lying. "An online raffle?" I repeated, raising an eyebrow. "That's some luck." "Yeah," he said, chuckling. "Guess my fortune's turning around." Harper came outside then, holding a mug of her own. She looked tired, as though she hadn't slept well. "Isn't it nice, Mom?" she said, forcing a smile. "He's been on cloud 9 since last night." I nodded, but my stomach churned. I couldn't shake the thought that every time I lost something, Mason seemed to gain something. Over the next few days, I noticed more signs of his good fortune. New clothes, a smartwatch even newer than the one I'd seen before, and expensive takeout deliveries arriving at their door several times a week. Harper seemed happy enough, though I caught her staring at receipts, more than once with a puzzled look. At first, I tried to convince myself I was just being paranoid. Maybe Mason had landed some freelance work. Maybe luck really had turned his way. But each explanation I came up with felt thinner than the last. Then one afternoon, while Harper was at work, I saw Mason cleaning the new car in the driveway. I walked out with a glass of lemonade and handed it to him. "Thanks," he said with a grin. "Mind if I take a look inside?" I asked casually. He hesitated, his eyes darting toward the car door, then back to me. Sure. Go ahead." I opened the driver's door and stepped inside. The leather seats smelled new, too new. I ran my hand over the dashboard, admiring the craftsmanship, until something caught my eye in the console. A thin envelope poked out from under a stack of papers. My name wasn't on it, but the handwriting looked eerily familiar. Before I could reach for it, Mason's hand came down fast, slamming the compartment shut. "Oh, that's just car paperwork," he said quickly, forcing a laugh. "You know how it is with dealerships." I smiled faintly, pretending to buy the excuse, but my heart was pounding. When Harper came home that evening, I tried to bring it up subtly. "So Mason's car, it's really something," I said. "Did the dealership give you any kind of paperwork for the raffle?" She frowned slightly. "Raffle? What raffle?" I froze. "He didn't tell you?" She shook her head. "No, he just said a friend helped him get a good deal." The room went quiet for a moment. Harper's brow furrowed, but she didn't press the topic further. I wanted to say more, to tell her what I'd overheard that night, but I didn't want to accuse her husband without proof. Later that night, I couldn't stop replaying everything in my mind. The whispers, the secrecy, the expensive purchases, all while I was still trying to recover from losing everything I had. Something inside me whispered a truth I didn't want to face. Mason hadn't been lucky. He'd been careful, calculating. The next day, I sat in the kitchen with a cup of coffee, scrolling through the news on my phone, trying to distract myself. Then, a photo in a local article caught my eye, a picture of a man being arrested for pawning stolen jewelry. I almost dropped the phone. In the background of that photo, on a shelf in the pawn shop, I spotted something familiar, a gold locket. My gold locket. I had given it to my mother before she passed, and it had been in the jewelry box that was stolen during the robbery. The engraving on the side was unmistakable. I immediately called the police detective who'd been handling my case and sent him the link. He promised to look into it, though he sounded skeptical. Still, it gave me a sliver of hope. That evening, Mason came home with a new set of car keys and tossed them on the table. "Upgrading already?" Harper teased, trying to lighten the mood. "Just a backup set," he said. But as he reached for them, his sleeve slid up slightly, and that's when I saw it. The watch. It wasn't just any watch. It was Daniel's. My late husband's gold watch, the one that had been stolen. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. The engraving, "To D.W. Love always, F." was right there. glinting under the kitchen light. He noticed me looking and tugged his sleeve down casually. "Something wrong?" he asked. I forced a shaky smile. "No, nothing at all." But inside, everything in me screamed. That watch had been on my husband's wrist when he died. I had kept it in a glass case for years because it meant more to me than anything else I owned. And now it was sitting on Mason's arm like a trophy. I barely made it through dinner that night, my mind spinning with anger, disbelief, and grief all tangled together. I wanted to rip it off his wrist and demand answers, but I knew I couldn't, not yet. I needed proof, evidence, something undeniable. So after everyone went to bed, I sat in the dark guest room, staring out the window at the car glistening under the streetlight. The pieces were starting to fit together in the worst possible way. And when I saw the same watch my husband used to wear glinting on Mason's wrist, my world cracked open. It was impossible to mistake it was my late husband's gold watch, engraved with his initials. For hours I sat there, trying to convince myself I'd imagined it. Maybe Daniel's watch had just looked similar. Maybe Mason had one that coincidentally had the same pattern, the same gleam, the same everything. But the moment I replayed the way he'd tugged down his sleeve, the way his expression shifted when he caught me looking, I knew. It wasn't coincidence. It was guilt. That night, I couldn't sleep. I tossed and turned, my heart pounding as images of the robbery flooded back. The empty drawers, the smashed jewelry case, the missing cash. And now, Mason with that watch, the very thing I had mourned losing as much as my husband himself. At dawn, I gave up on sleep altogether. I got out of bed and dug through my old photo albums, desperate for proof of what my eyes already knew. In one of the albums from our 20th anniversary, there it was Daniel standing by the lake, his arm around me, that same gold watch gleaming on his wrist. The same scratch near the clasp, the same engraving that read to D, W, love always, F. My stomach turned. I stared at that photo for a long time, tears stinging my eyes. That watch was sacred. I had guarded it for years, keeping it safe even when I could barely afford to keep the lights on after Daniel passed. And now it was on Mason's wrist. I pressed my hand over my mouth, trying not to sob out loud. Harper was still asleep, and I didn't want to wake her. I needed to think clearly, not emotionally. That morning, when Mason came into the kitchen, I pretended everything was fine. He poured himself coffee, whistling softly. "Sleep well?" he asked casually. "Not really," I said, forcing a small smile. "Still thinking about the robbery." He nodded slowly, sipping his coffee. "Yeah, terrible thing, but hey, at least you're safe now, right?" "Right," I replied, but I couldn't take my eyes off that watch. Every time he moved his wrist, the gold caught the light, stabbing through me like a blade. When he went to shower, I crept into the living room and pulled out my phone. I took pictures of the watch when he left it on the side table, clear shots of the engraving, the scratches, everything. My hands shook the entire time. I didn't know what I was going to do yet, but I knew one thing: I wasn't going to accuse him without evidence that would stand. If I was wrong, I'd destroy my relationship with Harper forever. But if I was right, I couldn't even finish that thought. When Harper came into the kitchen later, I studied her closely. She looked exhausted, dark circles under her eyes. Her hair hastily tied back. "Rough night?" I asked gently. She nodded, yawning. "Mason was up late again. I told him to come to bed, but he said he had some paperwork to do." "Paperwork?" I repeated, hiding the tension in my voice. "Yeah," she said with a shrug. "Probably something about that car or one of his projects." I nodded, pretending to believe it. But deep inside, I knew paperwork meant something else entirely. That afternoon, when they both went out to run errands, they said I searched the house. I know how that sounds, but desperation can make you do things you never thought you would. I checked the office first. Mason's desk drawers were neatly organized, almost suspiciously so. In one of them, I found a receipt from a pawn shop dated just 2 days after the robbery. My name wasn't on it, but the items listed gold necklace with initials F, W, and antique bracelet silver were mine. I snapped photos of the receipt, my hands trembling so badly I almost dropped my phone. Then I checked the bookshelf, the cabinets, anywhere something might be hidden. In the garage, tucked under a stack of old boxes, I found something worse, a small safe. It was portable, not much bigger than a shoebox, and the combination lock had fingerprints all over it. I didn't know the code, but I took photos of that too. When Mason and Harper came home later, I was sitting on the couch pretending to read. Mason gave me that same charming smile as he walked by. "Quiet day?" "Just resting," I said, looking up briefly. He nodded and went into the garage, probably to check on whatever secrets he'd buried in that safe. I knew I needed help. I wasn't equipped to handle this alone. But I couldn't go to Harper yet, not without undeniable proof. She loved him. And love can blind you worse than darkness. So I started documenting everything: dates, times, photos, receipts, even snippets of overheard conversations. I created a folder on my phone labeled Insurance Records, so if Mason ever found it, he wouldn't look too closely. Over the next few days, I noticed a change in Harper. She seemed more withdrawn, distracted, as if she knew something wasn't right but couldn't admit it to herself. Mason, on the other hand, was all smiles and charm, acting as though life couldn't be better. But every time he laughed, every time he brushed past me, I felt the bile rise in my throat. Because I knew the man standing in front of me had betrayed not just me but my husband's memory. Then one evening, as Harper and I were preparing dinner, she mentioned casually, "Mason's been going out Thursday nights. Says he's meeting a friend about job leads." "Every Thursday?" I asked, trying to sound indifferent. "Yeah, for the past month or so," she replied, slicing vegetables. "Why?" "No reason," I said quickly, forcing a smile. "Just curious." But my mind was already spinning. Thursday nights, always at the same time, always without her. I looked at her across the counter, her face soft and trusting. My heart ached knowing what I was about to do. That night, after everyone went to bed, I packed a small bag, just my phone, a notebook, and my car keys. If Mason was going somewhere that Thursday, I was going to find out where. I didn't know what I would discover, but I had to know. I owed it to Daniel. I owed it to myself. So when I learned Mason was meeting someone secretly every Thursday night, I decided to follow him. I waited in the shadows of their driveway one Thursday night, my heart thudding in my throat. The air was cool, the kind that bites at your skin and makes you second-guess every choice. I sat in my old sedan, parked just far enough down the street that Mason wouldn't notice. The lights in their house were dim, only the faint glow of the kitchen window visible from where I sat. At 7:58 p.m., right on cue, the front door opened. Mason stepped out, dressed neatly in dark jeans and a button-up shirt far too polished for a casual meetup with a friend. He glanced over his shoulder once, as if to make sure no one was watching, then slid into his shiny blue car. The engine purred to life, and I ducked slightly, waiting until he turned the corner before starting my own car. I followed at a distance, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly they hurt. Every instinct screamed at me to turn back. What was I doing, sneaking around like some private investigator? But another part of me, the part that needed the truth, kept my foot steady on the gas. He drove across town, past the shopping district and into the industrial area where most businesses closed after dark. My headlights caught glimpses of abandoned warehouses, broken fences, and rusted machinery. It was the kind of place where secrets felt at home. Finally, Mason turned into a narrow alley behind a row of old storage units. I slowed, cutting my lights and parking at the edge of the lot. From my spot, I could see him get out of the car and walk toward a small warehouse with a flickering security light above the door. Moments later, another man appeared from the shadows. He was older, with a shaved head and a heavy jacket. Mason handed him a thick white envelope. The man flipped through it quickly before nodding. Mason said something I couldn't hear, his gestures sharp and impatient. Then the man handed him a small black duffel bag. My breath caught. Cash? Jewelry? Evidence of the robbery? I grabbed my phone and zoomed in through the windshield, taking as many photos as I could without using flash. My hands were trembling, but I managed to capture everything: the exchange, their faces, even the license plate on the other man's truck. After a few minutes, they shook hands and went their separate ways. Mason walked back to his car, whistling softly, while the other man disappeared into the darkness. I sank lower in my seat as Mason's car passed by me, afraid he'd see me. But he drove off without a glance, his taillights fading into the night. When I was sure he was gone, I exhaled shakily, my body buzzing with adrenaline. I'd seen enough to confirm my fears. Mason wasn't just lying. He was involved in something deeply criminal. Still, one question burned in my mind. How much did Harper know? I followed him back home from a distance. He parked the car quietly, slipped inside the house, and turned off the porch light. Through the blinds, I could see him kiss Harper goodnight before heading to the living room. He looked calm, normal, like a man who had nothing to hide. But I had seen the truth. When I finally returned to my own house that night, the quiet was deafening. I sat in my car for a long time, staring at the photos on my phone. The evidence was there, clear and undeniable, but it wasn't enough. I needed to know what was in that black duffel bag. The next morning, Mason was in the kitchen when I came down. He was his usual charming self, flipping pancakes and humming under his breath. "You're up early," he said, glancing at me. "Couldn't sleep," I replied, pouring myself coffee. He smiled. "Still shaken from everything?" "Something like that," I said softly, hiding the anger boiling beneath the surface. As I sipped my coffee, I noticed the duffel bag sitting by the door. It looked just like the one I'd seen last night. My pulse quickened. I forced a yawn and said, "I think I'll lie down for a bit." Didn't rest much. I went back to the guest room, closed the door, and waited. 10 minutes later, I heard Mason's car start. He was leaving again. The moment he was gone, I hurried to the hallway. The bag was still there. I knelt down, my hands shaking as I slowly unzipped it. Inside were several small velvet pouches, stacks of cash bundled with rubber bands, and a few folded documents. My heart dropped as I recognized one of the necklaces, my mother's pearl pendant. It had been stolen the night of the robbery. I took photos of everything, quickly, afraid Mason might return. Then I zipped the bag shut, placed it exactly where it had been, and hurried back to my room. My chest felt tight. Every breath came in short, trembling bursts. There was no denying it anymore. Mason had robbed me. I spent the rest of the day pretending nothing was wrong, playing the role of the clueless mother-in-law. I laughed at his jokes, helped Harper with dinner, and forced smiles I didn't feel. But underneath that mask, I was planning my next move. I couldn't go to the police yet, not without hard proof linking him to the robbery. The photos and jewelry were strong evidence, but I needed something irrefutable, something that would make even Harper see the truth. That night, when everyone went to bed, I texted the detective from my case, attaching the photos of the bag, the jewelry, and the man from the warehouse. I didn't say much, just, "This might be connected to my robbery. Please look into it." He replied within minutes. "Got it. Don't confront him. We'll investigate." Those words gave me both comfort and fear. Because if the police were getting involved, things were about to escalate and fast. I lay awake the rest of the night, staring at the ceiling, listening to the sound of Mason's footsteps moving down the hall. He didn't know I'd seen him, didn't know I'd followed him, didn't know his secret was unraveling. But I did. And deep down, I knew that once the truth came out, our family would never be the same again. But I knew that envelope held the truth, and I was going to find out what was inside. 2 days later, I got my chance when Mason left his briefcase open in the living room. It was a Saturday morning, bright and calm, the kind of day that almost made me forget the darkness simmering beneath our roof. Harper had gone out to run errands, and Mason was in the shower. I was dusting the bookshelves, trying to appear casual, when I noticed the briefcase sitting half open on the coffee table. Normally, Mason never left it unattended. He carried that thing everywhere, tucked under his arm like it was filled with gold. I glanced down the hallway to make sure he was still in the bathroom. The sound of running water gave me courage. I knelt down beside the table, my hands trembling as I lifted the flap of the case. Inside, neatly organized, were two thick white envelopes. One was sealed. The other was slightly open, with the corner of a bank statement sticking out. I took a deep breath and slid it free. My eyes darted across the printed lines, and my blood ran cold. The statement had my name on it, Fiona Wallace. The account number, however, wasn't mine. It was a duplicate. A mirror of my real account, forged with my personal information but under a different branch. I flipped through the paper's withdrawals, transfers, transactions, all tied to an alias that belonged to Mason. There were notes scribbled in his handwriting, including amounts that matched exactly what had been stolen from my safe. It wasn't just theft. It was deliberate, planned. My hands shook as I turned the next page and found a copy of my homeowner's insurance documents with my signature forged at the bottom. Mason had filed a false claim under my name. He had not only robbed me, he'd been using my identity to profit from it. My mind reeled. I felt dizzy, like the ground beneath me had given way. The man who had smiled at my dinner table, who had hugged me after the robbery, who had promised to protect me, had been the one who destroyed me from the inside out. Then I saw the second envelope. I hesitated only a moment before opening it. Inside were stacks of $100 bills, bound with crisp rubber bands. Thousands of dollars. Alongside the cash were pawn slips, property receipts, and a printed email thread from a pawnbroker confirming sales of antique jewelry and collectible watches. At the bottom of the pile was a photo, a digital printout of Mason standing in that same warehouse I'd followed him to, shaking hands with the bald man. It was clear as day. I took a photo of everything, my phone's camera barely steady enough to focus. I knew I couldn't take the documents they'd notice, but I needed a record. My heart was pounding so loud I could barely hear the shower running anymore. I quickly slid everything back exactly as it was, and stepped away just as Mason's footsteps echoed down the hall. "Morning," he said casually, towel around his shoulders, hair wet and messy. "What are you up to?" "Oh, just tidying up," I said, forcing a smile. "Didn't want Harper to come home to a mess," he chuckled. "You're too good to us, Fiona." I watched him pick up the briefcase and carry it to his office, completely unaware that I had seen everything. For the rest of the day, my hands wouldn't stop trembling. I couldn't eat, couldn't focus on anything, but the images burned into my mind. I needed to tell someone, but who? If I went straight to Harper, she might think I was lying. Or worse, she might warn him. I decided to go to the police again. But before I could, something unexpected happened. That evening, Harper came home early and found me sitting at the dining table, my face pale and my phone clutched in my hand. She frowned. "Mom? You look like you've seen a ghost." I hesitated. My instinct told me to protect her. But another part of me, the one still shaking from betrayal, needed her to know. "I need to show you something," I said quietly. Before I could open my phone, Mason walked in. The tension in the room shifted instantly. His smile faltered as he looked between us. "What's going on?" he asked, voice carefully even. Harper's eyes darted between us. "Mom was about to show me something." Mason's tone sharpened. "What kind of something?" I stood, clutching my phone tightly. "I know, Mason." My voice wavered, but I met his gaze head-on. "I know what you did." His expression froze for a fraction of a second before morphing into a mask of confusion. "What are you talking about?" "You robbed me," I said, the words trembling out of me. "You staged the break-in. You took my jewelry, my money, my husband's watch. You took everything." Harper's head snapped toward him, her face draining of color. "Mason?" He laughed then, but it wasn't genuine, it was nervous, high-pitched. "Fiona, that's insane. Why would I cut him off?" "Because I saw the receipts, the bank statements, the pawn slips. You used my name, my information. I have photos of everything." Harper stared at him in disbelief. "Is that true?" she whispered. Mason's jaw clenched. "This is ridiculous. She's making it up." "Am I?" I shot. Back. Then show us what's in your briefcase. For the first time, he hesitated. That pause said more than any confession could. Harper saw it too. Mason, she said quietly, her voice breaking. What's in it? He rubbed his hands over his face, muttering, You don't understand. I didn't mean for it to go this far. I took a step closer. Then explain it. He sighed, shoulders slumping. I needed money, Fiona. I lost my job and I didn't know how to tell Harper. You had so much saved, what was I supposed to do? Watch my family fall apart? Harper's voice cracked. You stole from my mother. She didn't need it, he shouted, his voice suddenly sharp. She's insured. She'll get it all back. The room went silent. Harper covered her mouth, tears pooling in her eyes. You're unbelievable, she whispered. How could you? I stood there, numb, my mind spinning from the mix of rage and heartbreak. I wanted to scream, to hit him, to make him feel the pain he'd caused, but I didn't move. I just stared at the man I once called family, realizing I had never truly known him at all. Harper took a step back, her face pale. Get out, she said quietly. He blinked. What? You heard me. Get out. His jaw tightened, his eyes darting toward me. For a moment, I thought he might try to grab the briefcase and run, but Harper was faster. She snatched it off the table and held it behind her. Mason looked between us, anger flashing in his eyes before he stormed toward the door. You'll regret this, he hissed. But as the door slammed behind him, the only thing I felt was relief, and the tremor of something even bigger waiting to surface. But before I could decide what to do, Harper walked in and saw me holding the envelope. Harper's face turned pale when she saw what I held. The open envelope of cash was still in my shaking hands. The damning documents spread across the table between dollars and us. For a long moment, the world stood still. The hum of the refrigerator, the ticking of the kitchen clock, it all faded into the background as my daughter stared at me, her lips parting in shock. Mom, what are you doing? She finally asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I swallowed hard. Harper, we need to talk. She stepped closer, confusion shadowing her features. What is all that? I took a trembling breath and gestured toward the papers. Proof, I said quietly. Proof that Mason robbed me. Her brow furrowed. He staged the break-in, I continued, my voice trembling with fury and heartbreak. He took my jewelry, my savings, Daniel's watch, all of it. And he's been using my name to cash insurance claims. Harper shook her head slowly, like she couldn't process what she was hearing. Mom, that doesn't make sense. Mason would never. Before she could finish, Mason's voice came from the doorway. What's going on here? We both turned. He stood there, casual as ever, but his eyes darted to the table and froze on the money. The blood drained from his face. Where did you get that? He demanded. I straightened, summoning every ounce of strength left in me. You left it in your briefcase. You didn't even bother to hide it this time. Harper's gaze swung toward him, disbelief clouding her features. Mason, please tell me she's wrong. He forced a laugh, the sound brittle. Of course she's wrong. She's been through a lot. She's confused. That money, it's from a loan, I told you. I slammed my hand on the table. Stop lying, I shouted. My voice cracked, but I didn't care. I followed you, Mason. I saw you at that warehouse. I saw you hand over the envelope. I have pictures, receipts, even the pawn slips. It's over. Harper took a step back, eyes wide. Warehouse? She repeated, her voice trembling. Mason's mask of calm began to slip. You shouldn't have done that, he said quietly, his tone hardening. I shouldn't have? I snapped. You stole from me. You lied to my daughter. You destroyed everything I had left. For a moment, silence filled the room. Then Harper whispered, Mason, is it true? He looked at her, really looked at her, and for the first time since I'd known him, I saw fear. I didn't mean for it to happen like this, he said. I was desperate. You know how bad things got when I lost my job. I just needed time to fix it, to make things right. Harper's voice cracked. By stealing from my mother? I was going to pay it back, he shouted suddenly. You think I wanted this? You think I wanted to lie? She had money sitting there collecting dust while we were drowning in bills. I felt a sharp pain in my chest. That money was my life savings, I said softly. Daniel worked his whole life for it. You had no right. Mason turned toward me, his expression dark. I was trying to protect my family. By destroying it? Harper shot back. He clenched his fists, his jaw tightening. For a moment, I thought he might lash out, but then he looked at Harper, his eyes softening. You have to understand, I did it for us. Everything I did was for you. Tears filled her eyes. Don't you dare blame me for this. He reached out as if to touch her. But she stepped back, shaking her head. No, Mason. You don't get to twist this. He exhaled sharply and looked at me again. So what now, Fiona? You gonna call the cops? Turn your son-in-law in? I already have, I said quietly. They know everything. The color drained from his face completely. For a long moment, none of us moved. Then, without warning, he lunged forward, grabbing the papers off the table. Harper screamed, trying to snatch them back. He shoved her away, his movements wild, desperate. I stepped between them, my heart racing. You're only making it worse, Mason, I cried. He froze, chest heaving, his eyes darting between the two of us. For a moment, I saw the panic behind his anger, the realization that he'd lost control. Then Harper's voice broke through the tension, low and shaking but powerful. Get out. He blinked. What? Get out, she repeated, louder this time. Tears streaming down her face. You don't live here anymore. You don't get to touch me. You don't get to touch anything. Mason's mouth opened as if to argue, but she pointed toward the door, her hands trembling. Go. He looked at her, then at me, and something cold passed over his face. He dropped the papers on the floor, straightened his shirt, and muttered, You'll regret this, both of you. He grabbed his car keys from the counter and stormed out, slamming the door so hard the entire house shook. For a few seconds, Harper just stood there, staring at the closed door in stunned silence. Then her knees gave out, and she sank to the floor, sobbing. I rushed to her side, wrapping my arms around her. I'm so sorry, she cried into my shoulder. I didn't know, Mom. I swear I didn't know. I know, sweetheart, I whispered, stroking her hair. I know. We stayed like that for a long time, both of us crying her for the man she thought she knew, and me for the daughter caught in the wreckage of someone else's greed. When the tears finally stopped, Harper looked up at me, her eyes red but full of resolve. We have to finish this, she said. We have to make sure he can't hurt us again. I nodded, wiping her tears away. Then we'll do it together. That night, we gathered every piece of evidence, every photo, every document, every recording, and drove to the police station. As I handed the folder to the detective, a strange calm washed over me. For the first time in months, I felt in control. That's when Harper looked at him with pure disgust and said the words that shattered their marriage. Get out, she said, her voice steady but trembling with fury. Those two words echoed through the house long after Mason's footsteps had faded down the driveway. The silence that followed was suffocating, a silence that didn't feel peaceful but hollow, like the air itself was grieving what had just ended. I stood in the doorway, staring at the empty space where he'd been, my heart pounding in my chest. The man who'd once been part of our family, who'd smiled across the dinner table and toasted birthdays, had just walked out of our lives forever. And though part of me was relieved, another part, the part that had loved him like a son, felt the sharp sting of betrayal all over again. Harper slumped into a chair, burying her face in her hands. I crossed the room and knelt beside her, my hand on her shoulder. It's over, I whispered. He can't hurt us anymore. She shook her head slowly, her voice breaking. How could I not see it, Mom? How could I live with someone like that and have no idea? I squeezed her hand. Because you loved him, because you trusted him. None of this is your fault. She didn't answer, just sat there quietly, tears streaming down her cheeks. For the first time since the robbery, I saw how young she still was, my little girl, trying to hold herself together while the world she knew collapsed. The next morning, the house felt strange without Mason's presence. His coffee mug was still on the counter, his jacket hung over the chair, his shoes by the door. Little ghosts of him lingered everywhere. Harper walked through each room, collecting his things and tossing them into trash bags without saying a word. Are you sure you're ready for this? I asked gently. I don't have a choice, she said flatly. He's not coming back. When the police arrived later that day, Harper and I sat together in the living room as I handed over the folder of evidence I'd prepared. The detective, a tall man with kind eyes, flipped through the photos and documents carefully. This is solid, he said finally. We'll issue a warrant for his arrest. I'm sorry you've both had to go through this. Harper nodded stiffly, her hands clenched in her lap. Just make sure he pays for what he did, she said. The detective promised they would and left soon after. The moment the door closed behind him, Harper exhaled shakily, as if she'd been holding her breath for hours. That night, we sat at the kitchen table in silence, sipping tea that had long gone cold. I could see her mind racing, reliving moments, replaying memories, questioning everything. Finally, she whispered, he always told me he wanted to make things better for us. I thought he meant finding a new job, saving money, maybe starting over. I didn't know he meant this. You couldn't have known, I said softly. She looked up at me, her eyes glassy. Do you think he ever really loved me? My heart twisted at the question. I wanted to lie, to tell her yes, to give her some kind of peace, but I couldn't. I think he loved what you gave him, I said honestly. Stability, comfort, but people like Mason, they love control more than anything else. She nodded, tears spilling over again. I reached across the table and took her hands in mine. You're stronger than you think, Harper. You'll get through this. A few days later, the police called. They had found Mason hiding out at a friend's apartment across town. When they searched his belongings, they discovered several hidden accounts in his name, filled with stolen money not just from me, but from other people too. He'd been scamming his way through life for years, and we'd just been his latest victims. Harper broke down when she heard the news, but this time it wasn't grief, it was relief. He can't hurt anyone else now, she said quietly. The following week was a blur of court filings, police interviews, and endless questions from investigators. Harper stayed close to me the entire time, as though afraid I might vanish if she let go. I didn't mind. We needed each other. One afternoon, while sorting through paperwork for the case, Harper came across an old photo of her and Mason on their wedding day. They looked so happy, so naive. She stared at it for a long time, her fingers tracing the edges. Do you want me to throw it away? I asked softly. She hesitated, then shook her head. No, I need to keep it. Not because I want to remember him, but because I want to remember who I was before him. There was strength in her voice, a quiet resolve that hadn't been there before. A few days later, she packed up the last of Mason's things and left them on the porch. When the trash collectors came, she watched from the window as they hauled it all away. That's it, she said simply. That's the last of him. That night, we cooked dinner together, something we hadn't done in weeks. We laughed a little, cried a little, and tried to pretend that life could be normal again. But even as we cleaned the dishes and turned off the lights, I could see a shadow in Harper's eyes, a deep, quiet sadness that wouldn't disappear overnight. When she finally went to bed, I sat in the darkened living room, staring at the spot where Mason had stood when I confronted him. I thought about all the damage he'd done, not just to me, but to her. And though I felt proud that we had fought back, part of me still mourned the family we had lost. A few days later, the detective called again. We've officially charged him, he said. With theft, fraud, and identity forgery, you'll both be needed for statements. When I told Harper, she nodded. Good, I'll be there. She was calm, composed, stronger than I'd seen her in months. Watching her, I realized something important. Mason had taken so much from us, but he hadn't taken her spirit. He hadn't taken our love for each other. That night, before we went to bed, Harper turned to me and said quietly, "I know it's over, but it still hurts." "I know," I replied, brushing her hair from her face. "But pain fades, sweetheart. Truth doesn't. And you did the right thing." She smiled faintly. And for the first time, I saw a glimmer of peace in her eyes. But when they finally arrested him, another shocking layer of his betrayal came to light. The police discovered Mason had multiple secret bank accounts under fake names. When the detective told me that, I felt the room tilt for a moment. I had thought we already knew everything there was to know about his betrayal. But it turned out that the robbery, the forged insurance claims, and the stolen jewelry were only the surface. Beneath that, Mason had built an entire web of deceit, one that reached far beyond our family. Harper sat beside me in the police station, her hands clenched tightly in her lap. The detective spread a few folders across the table: bank records, property titles, and offshore account printouts, each one tied back to Mason. "He's been at this for a while," the detective said grimly. "At least 4 years, maybe longer. We've found accounts under 3 aliases. Some of the money came from your savings, Mrs. Wallace. But most came from other victims, people he scammed or borrowed from under false pretenses." Harper's voice trembled. "So he was stealing from other families too?" "Yes," the detective replied. "He's been using different stories for each one. In some cases, he pretended to be a financial advisor. In others, he posed as a contractor taking deposits for jobs he never completed." I pressed my hand to my chest, struggling to breathe evenly. "All this time," I whispered. "He was doing it right under our noses." Harper stared at the files, her face pale. Was any of what he told me true? Any of it at all? The detective hesitated before answering softly. "Probably not." The drive home was silent. Harper stared out the window the entire time, her reflection in the glass distant and broken. I could almost hear the questions swirling in her mind, the same ones I had asked myself after Daniel's death. How could someone you love lie so easily? How could they smile at you while destroying everything behind your back? When we got home, she went straight to her room. I stayed up in the kitchen, sifting through the papers the detective had let me copy. Each document was like a dagger. Mason's handwriting appeared again and again, his forged signatures, his notes about amounts. Even little reminders written in the margins like "Deposit Tuesday" or "Transfer to Cayman." He'd been living a double life for years. The robbery at my house had just been another payday. A few days later, the detective called again. They had traced several of my missing items, jewelry, antiques, and even one of Daniel's old collectible watches to international pawn shops. Some pieces had already been sold overseas. When he told me, I sat at the kitchen table in stunned silence. "So they're gone," I said flatly. "I'm afraid so," he replied gently. "We'll recover what we can, but much of it has changed hands too many times. I'm sorry." After the call, I looked around my home. The repaired windows, the replaced locks, the freshly painted walls. It all looked safe again, but the illusion was thin. I'd rebuilt the house, but not the trust I'd lost. Harper came out of her room later, her eyes red from crying. "They found his accounts," I said quietly. "It's worse than we thought." She nodded. "I figured. It always is." She sat down across from me, resting her head in her hands. "I keep trying to remember the man I married, but I can't. All I see now is this stranger." "You don't have to remember him," I said gently. "You just have to move forward." She looked up, her eyes wet but determined. "I will. But I want to see him face to face. When he goes to court, I want to look him in the eye and make him see what he's done." I reached across the table and took her hand. "Then we'll go together." A few weeks later, we did. The courtroom was cold, sterile, every sound echoing off the polished floors. When they brought Mason in, he looked different. Thinner, harsher. Gone was the confident, charming man who had smiled his way through every lie. In his place was someone tired and bitter, eyes darting nervously as the charges were read. He didn't look at us at first, not until Harper stood to give her statement. Her voice was steady, her words clear. She told the judge everything: the lies, the manipulation, the theft, the betrayal. She spoke not as a victim but as someone reclaiming her power. When she finished, Mason finally met her gaze. For a brief second, I saw something flicker across his face, regret, maybe, or just the awareness that he'd lost the one person who still cared for him. Afterward, we stepped out of the courtroom, the air crisp and cool against our faces. Harper didn't say much on the drive home. She didn't need to. The silence between us was no longer heavy with pain but filled with quiet resolve. That evening, as we sat on the porch watching the sunset, she asked softly, "Do you think he ever feels guilty?" I considered it for a moment before shaking my head. People like Mason don't feel guilt the way we do. They only feel sorry when they get caught. She nodded slowly, her gaze fixed on the fading horizon. Then that's his punishment, living with the truth of who he is. We sat there until the sun dipped below the trees, the air cooling around us. For the first time in months, I felt a small measure of peace. The police called one last time that week to confirm that Mason would remain in custody until sentencing. They promised to keep us updated if anything new came to light. "Thank you," I told the detective before hanging up. I stood in the middle of my kitchen for a long moment, the weight of everything finally settling on me. It was over, or so I thought. Because just as I started to believe the nightmare had ended, an envelope arrived in my mailbox the next morning. My name was written across it in a familiar, neat handwriting that made my blood run cold. It was from Mason. But just when I thought the worst was over, a letter from Mason arrived at my door. The letter came 2 weeks after his sentencing, written in Mason's neat handwriting. When I saw my name on the envelope, I froze. The return address, stamped in blue ink, confirmed what I already suspected. It came from the county correctional facility. I stood at the mailbox for a long moment, the cool morning air prickling my skin. My first instinct was to throw it away. I didn't want his words anywhere near me. But curiosity, dangerous, familiar curiosity, kept my fingers from letting go. I brought it inside, set it on the table, and stared at it for several minutes. Harper was at work, and part of me was glad she wasn't there to see it. She didn't need another reason to reopen her wounds. Finally, I sighed, grabbed a pair of scissors, and slit the envelope open. There was a single sheet of lined paper folded neatly inside. Mason's handwriting was as precise as ever, each letter formed with care. For a moment, that detail alone made my stomach twist. How could someone capable of so much cruelty still take the time to write so neatly? I unfolded it slowly. "Fiona, I know you probably don't want to hear from me, and I can't blame you for that. I've had a lot of time to think since I got here. I realize now how badly I messed up, not just with the robbery, but with you and Harper. I never meant for things to get so out of hand. I was desperate, Fiona. Desperate people make bad choices. I didn't plan to hurt you. I swear I didn't." "When I took the money, I thought I could replace it before you even noticed. I wanted to provide for Harper, to give her the life she deserved, but I didn't know how to tell her I was failing. I thought I could fix it all. I was wrong. I just don't want Harper to hate me forever. She doesn't deserve to carry that kind of anger. Please tell her that, if you can. Tell her I'm sorry." Mason, my hands trembled as I read his words. They were filled with excuses dressed up as remorse. The same pattern he'd used on us for years, half-truths laced with sentiment, meant to make him sound human again. I set the letter down and stared at it for a long time. The worst part was, a small piece of me wanted to believe him. I wanted to believe that the man who had eaten dinner in my home, who had made my daughter laugh, who had promised to protect us, had just lost his way. But deep down, I knew better. Mason wasn't sorry. He was sorry he got caught. When Harper came home that evening, I debated whether to tell her about the letter. She walked into the kitchen, dropped her keys on the counter, and said, "You look like you've seen a ghost." I hesitated. "A letter came today. From him." Her face hardened instantly. "What did he say?" I slid the paper across the table. She didn't sit down, just stood there reading it, her expression unreadable. When she finished, she folded it neatly and placed it back on the table. "Do you believe him?" she asked. I shook my head. "No, do you?" Her eyes glistened, but her voice stayed steady. "Not anymore." She turned and walked out to the porch, wrapping her arms around herself as she stared out at the fading evening light. I followed her, standing quietly beside her. For a few moments, neither of us spoke. Then she said softly, "It's strange. I used to dream about getting an apology from him. I thought it would make things easier, but reading it just makes me feel empty." "I know," I said. "Sometimes closure doesn't come from the person who hurt you. It comes from walking away." She nodded slowly. "Then I'm walking away." The next morning, Harper handed me the letter again. "Do what you want with it," she said simply. "I don't want it in the house." I looked down at the page one last time. The careful handwriting, the manipulative phrasing. Then I tore it in half, and again, until all that was left were scraps small enough to forget. I dropped them into the fireplace, struck a match, and watched as the paper curled and blackened into ash. The flames reflected in the glass like tiny shards of freedom. From that moment on, Mason was no longer a presence in our lives. Harper filed for divorce a week later. It was quick, mercifully so. She didn't even show up to the final hearing, her lawyer handled everything. When it was over, she came home, sat at the kitchen table, and said quietly, "It's done." I reached across the table and squeezed her hand. "How do you feel?" She gave a small, sad smile. "Like I can breathe again." Over the next few months, we started to rebuild. Harper found a new job at a design firm in the city. She started seeing a therapist too, which helped her untangle the mess Mason had left in her mind. I focused on restoring my home, piece by piece. Every repaired wall, every replaced piece of furniture, felt like reclaiming a part of myself. Then one day, while cleaning out the attic, I found a box I didn't recognize. It was tucked behind some old paint cans, dusty and sealed with duct tape. At first, I thought Mason had hidden something there. My heart pounded as I dragged it down and opened it. Inside were old photo albums, most of them from years before Harper's marriage. At the very bottom, wrapped in tissue paper, was something else, a small USB stick. I frowned, wondering what it contained. I plugged it into my laptop, and a single video file popped up. Camera. Feed. 4. My old home security footage. I'd thought the robbery had destroyed the cameras, but apparently, one of them had survived. I clicked play, and the grainy black and white video began to roll. It showed the night of the robbery, the front door bursting open, figures moving quickly through the house. My breath caught as I leaned closer to the screen. There he was. Mason. He wasn't wearing a mask. And he wasn't alone. Standing beside him, trembling, was Harper. But one final discovery in my old security footage would change how I saw that night forever. While cleaning, I found a forgotten USB from my old security camera system. I never expected it to work. The device was covered in dust, its label half faded, and I nearly threw it away. But curiosity got the better of me. I plugged it into my laptop, expecting corrupted files or static. Instead, a folder appeared instantly, titled Homecam Backup. Inside, there was one video time-stamped the night of the robbery. For a long moment, I just stared at the screen. My hand hovered over the mouse, my heart hammering. Part of me didn't want to see it. I wasn't sure if I could handle reliving that night. But I had to know. I had to see what really happened. When I clicked play, the footage flickered to life, in grainy black and white. The camera was angled toward the living room, the same room where I'd found everything destroyed. For several seconds, nothing moved. Then, suddenly, the door burst open. My breath caught, Two figures stepped inside, both wearing dark hoodies. One was tall and broad-shouldered, the other smaller, hesitant. The tall one went straight to my drawers, rifling through them with quick, confident movements. The smaller one lingered near the door, her hands shaking. Then the tall one turned toward the camera and I saw him. Mason. It was like watching my nightmares come to life. Every fear, every suspicion, every sleepless night, all of it crystallized in that single horrifying image. He wasn't wearing a mask. His face was clear as day, calm, methodical. He knew exactly what he was doing. I sat frozen, tears welling in my eyes. I wanted to scream, to smash the laptop, to erase the proof of his betrayal. But I couldn't move. My gaze drifted to the smaller figure still by the door. Something about her posture looked familiar. Her trembling hands, the way she kept glancing at him as though pleading silently. Then, when Mason turned toward her, the camera caught her face in the light for just one brief second and I felt the air leave my lungs. It was Harper. My daughter. She wasn't stealing. She wasn't moving around the room like Mason was, she just stood there, crying. Her mouth moved, and though the footage had no sound, I could tell she was begging him to stop. I leaned closer, watching as she followed him to the dresser, shaking her head frantically. Mason ignored her, tearing through my things, grabbing jewelry and emptying boxes. At one point, she reached out, trying to grab his arm. But he pushed her away hard enough that she stumbled into the wall. I pressed pause, my vision blurring from tears. My baby. My only child. She had been there that night, trapped in something I hadn't even known existed. For several minutes, I just sat there, trembling. The betrayal I'd felt before was replaced by something far heavier: heartbreak. Because as the shock faded, the truth became clearer. She hadn't been helping him. She had been forced. I pressed play again. Harper was crying openly now, her hands covering her face. Mason grabbed the safe from under the bed and yanked it open. He must have known the code already. She followed him helplessly, trying to reason with him. I could see her mouthing something, but he didn't look at her once. Then he took Daniel's watch. He slipped it into his pocket without hesitation, completely indifferent. Harper shook her head again and ran toward the door. Mason shouted something, his mouth forming words sharp enough that I could almost hear them through the screen. She froze, her back against the doorframe, paralyzed by fear. I let out a sob I hadn't realized I was holding. All those months I thought she'd chosen him over me, that she'd looked the other way. She hadn't. She'd been living a nightmare of her own, caught in his manipulation, his threats. When the footage ended, I sat back in my chair, numb. My heart ached for her, for the guilt she must have carried all this time. That evening, when she came home, I didn't know how to start. I just stood there in the kitchen, holding the USB in my hand. She froze when she saw my expression. "What's wrong, Mom?" she asked carefully. I swallowed hard. "I found something." Her eyes flickered to the USB, and I saw it immediately, the recognition, the panic. "Where did you get that?" she whispered. "It was in the attic," I said quietly. "I watched it, Harper." Tears filled her eyes instantly. "Mom, please, I didn't—" I shook my head, stepping closer. "You don't have to explain. I saw everything." She broke then, sobbing as she covered her face with her hands. "He said he'd leave me if I didn't help him. He said we needed the money. I told him no, over and over, but he wouldn't listen. I tried to stop him, Mom. I swear I did." I wrapped my arms around her, holding her tight as she cried into my shoulder. "I know, sweetheart. I know." For the first time since this nightmare began, I felt something other than anger. I felt compassion. My daughter had been a victim too. She had lived under the same roof as a man capable of cruelty beyond comprehension. We sat together for a long time, both of us crying, both of us letting years of guilt and pain spill out in silence. When she finally calmed down, she looked up at me with red-rimmed eyes. "What are you going to do with the video?" she asked softly. "I've already sent a copy to the detective," I said. "They'll add it to the case file. But I wanted you to know that I don't blame you. Not for any of it." Her lower lip trembled. "You should hate me." I shook my head. "No, Harper. I could never hate you. You were trapped in his lies just like I was." But now we're free. She nodded slowly, taking a shaky breath. I want to move forward, Mom. I want to let this go. We will, I said, brushing her hair back from her face. We'll heal. Together. That night, as I lay in bed, I replayed the video in my mind, not the theft. Not Mason's cruelty, but Harper's tears. Her desperate attempts to stop him. It hurt to remember, but it also gave me something new. Understanding. For the first time, I wasn't just the victim of a crime. I was a mother who had survived and forgiven. I knew then that forgiveness would take time, but healing had finally begun. Months passed, and the silence in my home began to feel peaceful again. It was a strange sensation after everything that had happened. I thought silence would always remind me of fear, but instead, it began to sound like healing. The hum of the refrigerator, the rustle of curtains in the breeze, the creak of floorboards under my slippers, it all felt alive again, comforting instead of haunting. Harper moved in with me for a while after the court hearings ended. The police had everything they needed. Mason had been sentenced, and the case was officially closed. But I could tell the emotional pieces still needed time to settle. She tried to stay busy, cleaning, cooking, repainting the walls, fixing broken things around the house. It was her way of taking back control. One morning, I found her standing in the living room, staring at the patch of floor where my safe used to be. It feels smaller now, she murmured. The house. Or maybe I'm just seeing it differently. I smiled softly. You're seeing it without fear for the first time. She nodded, her eyes filling with tears. I thought I'd never feel safe again. You are now, I said. We both are. Over the next few weeks, we threw ourselves into rebuilding not just the house, but our lives. We replaced the furniture Mason had destroyed, hung new curtains, and painted the walls a warm cream color that made the whole place glow in the sunlight. Harper picked the colors. She said she wanted everything to feel fresh and alive. Every day felt like another small victory. When we unpacked my recovered items, what few pieces the police had managed to trace back, I couldn't stop crying. They'd found Daniel's gold watch in an evidence locker, slightly scratched but still ticking. I held it in my hands, the familiar weight grounding me. It still works, I whispered. Harper smiled faintly. Maybe it's a sign. I slipped it onto my wrist. A sign of what? That you survived, she said quietly. We started cooking together in the evenings, just like we used to before Mason came into our lives. I'd chop vegetables while she stirred the sauce, our conversation flowing easily again. Sometimes we laughed until we cried over small things, burned toast, bad recipes, her clumsy attempts at fixing the leaky sink. It felt good to laugh again. One afternoon, Harper suggested we donate Mason's remaining belongings, the ones left behind when he was arrested. At first, I hesitated. The thought of touching anything that had belonged to him made my skin crawl. But she was right. Keeping those things around meant keeping pieces of him with us. We boxed up his clothes, shoes, and old electronics. When the donation truck came, we stood on the porch and watched as they carried the boxes away. Harper exhaled deeply, her shoulders relaxing as if she'd been holding her breath for months. That's it, she said softly. That's the last of him. That evening, we sat in the living room, the glow of the sunset filtering through the windows. Harper turned to me suddenly and said, I want to start over, really start over. I've been thinking about going back to school, maybe interior design. I think I'd be good at it. I smiled. You'd be amazing at it. Her eyes softened. You really think so? I know so. I said. You've already redesigned this whole house. You made it feel alive again. She laughed, a genuine laugh that filled the room. Maybe you're right. It wasn't just the house she was rebuilding, it was herself. As the months rolled by, Harper began therapy in earnest. She talked about everything, the fear, the manipulation, the guilt. She came home lighter each time, as if shedding invisible layers of pain. And slowly, I started healing too. I reopened my craft store after nearly a year of being closed. My customers welcomed me back with open arms, their support overwhelming. Many of them had followed my story in the local paper, how I'd been robbed by someone I trusted, how justice had finally been served. They came not just to shop, but to check on me, to remind me that I wasn't alone. "I'm so proud of you, Mom," Harper said one afternoon, helping me restock candles. "You could have given up, but you didn't." I smiled. "Neither did you." The community rallied around us in ways I never expected. A neighbor helped repair my porch for free. Friends from church brought over home-cooked meals. Someone even left a small note in my mailbox that said, "You're stronger than what broke you." I kept it pinned above my kitchen counter as a quiet reminder. As winter turned to spring, Harper began spending more time outside again. She'd take long walks by the lake, sketching the scenery or photographing the sunsets. It was as if she was reclaiming her connection to the world a world that Mason had tried to cage her from. One evening, she came home with paint on her hands and a smile on her face. "I signed up for classes," she announced. "Night courses start next month." I hugged her tightly. "I'm so proud of you, sweetheart." "Thanks, Mom," she whispered, "for not giving up on me." That night, after she went to bed, I sat by the window, listening to the crickets outside. The air was still, soft, alive with quiet peace. For the first time since the robbery, I felt something close to joy. I looked around my home, the warm colors, the scent of fresh paint, the photos of Daniel, Harper, and me lining the walls. Every corner told a story of survival. The scars were still there. Of course. They always would be. But scars don't mean weakness, they mean healing. As I glanced down at the gold watch on my wrist, still ticking faithfully after all this time, I smiled. Time hadn't stopped for us. It had carried us forward, one breath, one day, one act of courage at a time. And for the first time in years, I felt ready to dream again. And one quiet morning, I realized I wasn't just surviving anymore, I was finally free. It's been 2 years since the night that changed everything, and I've never felt stronger. Time has a strange way of healing what we once thought impossible. The house that was once a crime scene is now my sanctuary again, filled with laughter, light, and the faint smell of fresh coffee each morning. The walls no longer whisper memories of fear, they hum with resilience. Harper still lives nearby, in a small apartment just a few streets away. After finishing her design courses, she started her own small business decorating local homes. Watching her talk about color palettes and lighting schemes, I sometimes catch glimpses of the girl she used to be: creative, confident, full of life. But now there's something more. Strength. The kind that's forged only after surviving something you thought would destroy you. We talk every day. She drops by for coffee most mornings before heading to work, and we walk together by the lake on weekends. The same lake where Daniel and I used to spend our summers. The place that once brought back painful memories now feels peaceful again. One morning, as we sat on a bench watching ducks glide across the water, Harper said quietly, "You know what's strange? I don't hate him anymore." I turned to her, surprised. "You don't?" She shook her head. "I think hate kept me tied to him for too long. I don't want him to have that power anymore." I smiled softly. "That's not strange, sweetheart. That's healing." She nodded, her gaze distant. "You were right, you know. Forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting. It just means choosing peace over pain." I reached for her hand, and she squeezed mine gently. "You've grown so much," I said. "So have you," she replied with a smile. Those words stayed with me long after that morning. It was true. I had grown too. I wasn't the frightened woman who'd stood shaking in her own living room 2 years ago. I had learned to trust again, not just others, but myself. After everything, I decided I needed a place that was entirely my own. So last year, I bought a small cabin by the lake, simple, cozy, surrounded by pine trees and wildflowers. It's where I go on weekends to write, paint, or just sit on the porch with a book. Sometimes Harper visits and helps me garden. Other times, I go alone, letting the quiet soothe me. The first time I stayed there overnight, I couldn't help but think about Daniel. I brought his old watch with me and set it on the nightstand beside the bed. As I listened to its steady ticking, I whispered, "We're okay now." It felt like he could hear me somehow, like the man I loved was still watching over us, proud of how far we'd come. there are still moments when the past flickers back to life, like when I see someone wearing a similar car to Mason's or catch a whiff of his old cologne in a store. But the panic no longer takes over. Those ghosts no longer own me. I've learned that survival isn't just about making it through the storm, it's about rebuilding once the clouds clear. About choosing to live without bitterness. Last month, a local women's group invited me to speak at one of their meetings. They wanted to hear my story, to understand how I'd rebuilt my life after betrayal. At first, I hesitated. I didn't see myself as an inspiration, just someone who'd done what she had to do to survive. But Harper encouraged me. "Mom," she said, "your story could help someone else who feels trapped. You have no idea how powerful that could be." So I went. I stood before a room full of women, some young, some my age, and told them everything. The robbery, the lies, the heartbreak, and the healing. I spoke honestly, not about revenge or anger, but about rediscovery, about learning to trust again, to breathe again. When I finished, the room was silent for a moment. Then one woman stood and began to clap, and soon everyone joined in. A few came up to me afterward, sharing their own stories of betrayal, of loss, of survival. I realized then that pain might shape us, but it doesn't define us. That night, Harper hugged me before leaving. "You did something good today," she said. I smiled. We both did. Because healing hadn't been just my journey, it was ours. Sometimes, late at night, I still find myself sitting by the window, looking out at the stars. I think about the past, yes, but not with anger anymore. I think about how even the darkest moments led me here. To this place of peace and strength. Mason is still in prison. We get occasional updates from the court, but we don't dwell on them. He's no longer part of our story. Not really. He's just a closed chapter in a book that continues without him. Harper is dating someone new now, a kind man, named Ryan, who treats her with the respect she always deserved. When she first introduced me to him, she looked nervous, almost fragile. But I could tell by the way he looked at her that she was safe. Seeing her smile freely again, really smile, was all the closure I ever needed. As for me, I've found purpose again. My craft shop is thriving, and I've even started a small art group for widows and single women in our community. We meet on Friday evenings to paint, drink tea, and talk about life. It's not about forgetting the past, it's about creating something new from it. The other day, Harper stopped by the cabin while I was sketching by the lake. She handed me a small wrapped box. Inside was a delicate silver bracelet with a tiny engraving, still standing. I laughed softly, tears filling my eyes. "You always know what to say without saying it," I told her. She smiled. I learned from the best. As the sun set behind the trees, we sat side by side in comfortable silence, the lake shimmering with golden light. I realized then that the pain, the fear, and the heartbreak, all of it had led us here. To peace, to freedom, to life after. And maybe that's what surviving really means, not pretending the past never happened, but refusing to let it define what comes next. Because sometimes, the worst thing that happens to you becomes the beginning of everything good that follows.